Hi there, John Wilkinson again, and History Made Easier again. In my look at life in the trenches, I'll first explain the system of trenches and then focus on the experience of soldiers. In this first slide, you will see, moving from left to right, no man's land, the land in between the two trench systems, the barbed wire defence system, and then the frontline trench. Behind that, the support trench, and behind that, the reserve trench, where the supplies and casualty stations would also be placed. And at the very back, the artillery positions. Linking the trenches were communication trenches that allowed for men and supplies to be moved up and down. Note that the trenches were zigzagged. This was to limit the damage of an exploding shell, as well as the range of fire the enemy would have if they got into the trenches. Here's an aerial photograph of a small section of trenches to give you a bird's eye view of them. Next is a cross-section of a typical trench. Things to note: the depth of the trench would ideally be sufficient to protect the men from enemy sniper fire, with a duckboard to protect the men from the water that would be an almost permanent presence. There would be a firing step for when they took up position to fire at the enemy, with protection front and rear from sandbags. The barbed wire served to protect the trenches from an enemy attack, and the dugout gave some shelter during bombardments and rest periods. Soldiers wouldn't spend their whole time on the front line, but would rotate between the three trenches, as well as take regular leave. On average, they would spend 6 to 14 days in the frontline trench. But the reality of the trenches was very different from the sanitized diagrams I have shown you. Very different. For most of the time, for both sides, life in the trenches had a routine to it. The day would begin before dawn with stand to, which meant standing on the fire step to ensure against a surprise attack. In the morning, there would usually be a mixture of rifle and machine gun fire, trench mortars, and maybe a brief bombardment from the enemy's artillery, just to let you know they were still there and to add to your sense of insecurity and general misery. Sentries would be placed all day, with 2-hour stints the norm, whilst the daily chores took over, repairing and strengthening trenches, including filling sandbags, cleaning equipment, and taking rest, maybe writing letters home. Possibly after an attempt to delouse oneself. More of that later. But the danger of sniper fire was constant. Stand 2 would be repeated for the last hour of daylight, before the dangerous activity which would take place at night with the night patrols. They were made in order to carry out repairs to the barbed wire that protected their trenches from frontal assaults, or else to cut the enemy's wire if an attack was planned, to listen in and generally spy on the enemy, seize prisoners for interrogation, intelligence gathering, or else to recover wounded as well as the dead after an attack. The daily dangers, not the constant shelling or the gas attacks, not going over the top, but routine life in the trenches, were also very real and took a toll on men's morale. The daily grind of surviving in miserable conditions, the mud, the water, the cold in winter, the sun in summer, the lice and the rats, and the constant lack of sleep. lie spread in the men's uniforms, burying themselves in the stitching where they could hardly be got at. Lice fed 12 times a day and laid at least 5 eggs a day. The incessant itching drove men mad, and their scratching led to bleeding sores, infections, and much worse, typhus. Trench foot, which was a result of standing in water day after day, was a very serious matter. It was also very painful. The foot could swell to 2 or 3 times its normal size, and from this point, if the swelling reduces, it causes tremendous pain. But if the swelling doesn't go down, the foot or even the leg would have to be amputated. Daily life in the trenches then was bad, very bad. But the tactic of the frontal mass attack used to dislodge the enemy from their trenches led to many, many more casualties. Enormous bombardments that did insufficient damage to the enemy lines, but turned no man's land into a desolate waste of mud, with shell holes the only form of cover, preceded the attacks. The infantry would then charge towards the enemy defences, often carrying a heavy pack and armed with only a rifle, a bayonet, and grenades. They would then face the combined nightmare of the machine gun and barbed wire. They would be held up before the enemy trenches by barbed wire, and as they tried to find a way through it, they were mowed down in their tens of thousands by the machine guns. Many survived the experience of going over the top only by resorting to the psychological armor that such horrific deaths happened to others, not me. A final word on the casualties. Apart from the number killed, more than twice the number were badly wounded. Many lost limbs or were blinded by gas, or else their lungs poisoned by it. Many came home suffering from shell shock, a psychological disorder resulting from the terror of bombardments, but also from deafening gunfire, lack of sleep, the loss of comrades who had become close friends, gruesome sights, and the stress of living in constant danger. In other words, the result of life in the trenches. Let's pause and take a look at the numbers on show here, and remember that these were people's lives. History is always about people and their lives. Thank you so much for listening.